A woman we'll call Layla grew up in a Christian village in the mountains of Lebanon, where her grandmother told the same story every summer, sitting on the same porch, pointing toward the same stretch of coastline, visible in the distance on clear evenings. Their family, her grandmother insisted, descended from a French knight who came with the Crusaders, fell in love with a local woman, and never went home. It explained in her grandmother's telling the lighter hair that occasionally showed up in family photographs, the surname that sounded just slightly foreign next to their neighbors, the vague sense that their family had always stood a little apart in the village, tied to the coast and to Europe in a way nobody could quite prove, but nobody quite denied either. Layla believed it the way most people believe a good family story. Not literally exactly, but something true enough to matter, repeated so many times across so many summers that questioning it felt almost disrespectful. The village itself was old enough that the stones in the church had been cut before anyone kept records. On those evenings, with the Mediterranean turning gold in the distance, the story felt as solid as the mountains behind them. But as Layla grew older, went to university in Beirut, and learned to ask the kinds of questions her grandmother never had to, a quiet doubt took root. Not disbelief, something gentler than that. Just the awareness that a story told for 800 years might have been polished smoother than the truth it started from. Still, spitting into a tube felt like a small betrayal, as if she were asking a stranger to adjudicate her grandmother's memory. When genetic testing became affordable and popular, Layla did what a lot of people with a story like hers eventually do. She sent away for a kit, mailed back a vial of saliva, and waited for the results to either confirm or quietly bury 800 years of family legend. What she got back wasn't a clean yes or no. It was something far stranger, and to understand why, you have to go back to a hole in the ground outside the city of Sidon on the coast of Lebanon, where in 2009, archaeologists dug up the actual answer to Layla's family story, buried in a mass grave for nearly 8 centuries, waiting for a science that didn't exist yet. The pit wasn't discovered by accident. Claude Dumais-Serral's team had been working the Sidon site for years, uncovering layers of Canaanite, Phoenician, and medieval occupation before they reached a stratum of churned earth and human bone. The skeletons weren't arranged. They had been thrown in together, limbs tangled, skulls showing the distinctive blunt force trauma of medieval close combat. Some had healed fractures from earlier fights, the marks of men who had already survived violence once before. Others had the clean, unhealed cuts of the wounds that killed them. In the dry academic language of the excavation report, they were commingled and incomplete. In reality, they were the aftermath of a single afternoon of extreme violence, frozen in the ground for 8 centuries, waiting for a technology that could finally ask them who they were. What they found in that pit is where this story really begins, and it's a story that most people assume has an obvious ending. Ask almost anyone what the Crusades did to Europe's genetic makeup, and you'll get some version of the same answer. 2 centuries of holy war, hundreds of thousands of European men marching to the Near East, must have permanently rewired the DNA of an entire continent. It's a compelling assumption. It also turns out to be almost exactly backwards. And the real story, the one written directly into ancient bone, is more surprising than the myth it replaces. The excavation near Sidon uncovered the remains of a minimum of 25 individuals, radiocarbon dated to between 10025 and 1283 CE. Buried together in a mass grave near the ruins of a Crusader castle, their skeletons showing clear signs of violent death in battle. Sidon sat at the heart of the story for nearly 2 centuries. It was a key stronghold of the Crusaders' Kingdom of Jerusalem, fought over repeatedly between Crusader forces and Muslim armies from 1110 to 1249. And the bodies in that pit almost certainly belonged to soldiers killed in one of those specific battles. For 800 years, they lay there as a piece of pure archaeology, a scene without a script. Then, in the mid-2010s, a team led by geneticist Mark Haber, working with Chris Tyler Smith at the Wellcome Sanger Institute in the UK, did something that had never been attempted with Crusader remains before. They extracted and sequenced whole genomes directly from 9 of those skeletons. That alone was a genuine scientific achievement, and it's worth pausing on why. Because it explains why this kind of direct evidence about the Crusades had never existed until so recently. Ancient DNA degrades quickly in hot, humid climates, and the Near East is about as difficult an environment for DNA preservation as exists anywhere on Earth, a stark contrast to the cold, dry conditions of Northern Europe or Siberia that have yielded some of the best preserved ancient genomes ever recovered. Crusader burial sites specific enough to be confidently identified are also exceptionally rare. Most Crusader-era remains that have survived at all can't be tied to a documented battle or a specific historical moment with any precision, and archaeologists working across the region had spent decades finding scattered bones without the accompanying context needed to know whose story those bones were actually telling. Sidon was the exception, thanks in large part to years of careful excavation led by archaeologist Claude Dumais-Serral, whose team had already spent seasons working the site before the mass grave was uncovered. A genuine, datable snapshot of exactly who was fighting and dying in the Holy Land during the height of the Crusades, preserved well enough against considerable odds for modern sequencing technology to actually read it nearly 800 years later. What that sequencing revealed upended the tidy version of the story almost immediately. Of the 9 individuals whose genomes were successfully analyzed, 3 carried genetic ancestry consistent with Western Europe, men who, biologically, could have grown up anywhere from northern France to the Low Countries. Exactly the profile you'd expect from a Crusader army recruited across Latin Christendom. 4 carried ancestry essentially indistinguishable from the local Near Eastern population of the time, almost certainly local fighters, allies, or defenders caught up in the same violent episode. And 2 individuals carried something else entirely, a genetic mixture of both European and Near Eastern ancestry in a single genome. Not 2 separate populations standing near each other in a mass grave. 2 men whose own parents had already come from different sides of that same conflict, born from unions between European settlers and local women within a generation or 2 of the first Crusaders' arrival. That detail alone is worth sitting with, because it quietly demolishes a popular image of the Crusades as 2 entirely separate populations, permanently walled off from each other by faith and blood and violence, glaring at one another across a battle line for 200 years. The genetic evidence says something messier and more human. Soldiers, settlers, and local populations were intermarrying, having children, and building mixed families almost as soon as the Crusader states were established, in the very same generation as the fighting itself. History books tend to remember the sieges. The genomes remembered the marriages nobody wrote down. Medieval chroniclers actually had a word for exactly this population, even if they rarely wrote about it with much warmth. Children born to European settlers and local mothers in the Crusader states were known as poulains, and contemporary accounts describe them as a distinct, sometimes uneasy presence within Crusader society, fluent in local languages and customs in ways the newest arrivals from Europe were not, and viewed with suspicion by freshly arrived Crusaders precisely because they had assimilated so thoroughly into the world their fathers had supposedly come to conquer. Some medieval writers complained that poulains had gone soft, adopting local dress, local diplomacy, even local sympathies, blurring a boundary the original Crusaders had crossed an ocean specifically to defend. The genomes from that mass grave in Sidon are, in a very real sense, the biological confirmation of a population medieval writers already knew existed and quietly resented. Proof, 800 years later, that the poulains weren't a slur invented by nervous chroniclers, but a measurable living reality buried in the region's DNA the entire time. If the story stopped there, it would already be a strong candidate for the Crusades permanently altered the region's DNA. Real, datable, genome-level evidence of intermixing, appearing within 1 or 2 generations, across an entire population caught in the middle of a 2-century religious war. That sounds exactly like the kind of event that should leave a permanent, traceable signature for the next 800 years. This is exactly where the study takes its most unexpected turn, the one that should reframe everything you thought you knew about how history writes itself into a genome. Haber's team didn't stop at sequencing the Crusader-era skeletons. They also sequenced the genomes of 4 individuals from the same region who had lived roughly 1,000 years earlier during the Roman period, well before the Crusades ever began, a genetic snapshot of what the local population had looked like before any of this happened. Then, they compared both of those ancient samples against the genomes of 99 modern Lebanese volunteers, living today, in the same stretch of coastline where all of this took place. If the Crusades really had permanently altered the region's genetic makeup, that comparison should have shown it clearly. Modern Lebanese genomes carrying a measurable, lasting signature of medieval European ancestry, passed down faithfully across roughly 30 generations. That is not what the data showed. When Haber's team compared the ancient Roman period genomes to the genomes of modern Lebanese people today, what they found was continuity, not disruption. A population that looks, genetically, remarkably similar to the one that lived there 2,000 years ago, as if the intervening centuries had barely touched it. The genetic diversity captured in that 13th century mass grave, the mixed ancestry soldiers, the clear signature of European men fathering children with local women, had almost entirely vanished from the population by the present day. Haber himself put it about as plainly as a scientist allows himself to. If you only looked at the genetics of people living in Lebanon during the Roman period, and then the genetics of people living there today, you would conclude that nothing significant happened in between. You would completely miss that. For roughly 2 centuries, this exact population included Europeans and people of mixed European and Near Eastern ancestry, living, marrying, and dying side by side. That's the twist this entire investigation turns on, and it deserves to be said plainly because it directly contradicts the assumption almost everyone starts with. The Crusades did not permanently rewrite the genetic code of the region they were fought over, let alone the genetic code of Europe itself. The admixture was real. It was significant enough to show up clearly in a mass grave of 9 soldiers. And within a relatively small number of generations, it was diluted back down to statistical invisibility, swallowed by the much larger surrounding population until it left no measurable trace at all. Haber's team gave this phenomenon a name that has since become the defining phrase for the entire study: a transient pulse of genetic admixture. Not a permanent scar, a pulse. A brief, intense signal that flared up during the conflict itself and then faded out almost completely once the political and demographic conditions that produced it disappeared. Think of it as a drop of ink falling into a glass of water. The first generation, the child of a crusader and a local woman, is half ink, half water, a visible, unmistakable blend of the two. The next generation, marrying back into the surrounding local population, is a quarter ink, then an eighth, then a 16th. Each new generation stirring the glass a little more, spreading that original drop across an ever larger volume of ordinary water. By the 10th generation, the ink is still there in theory, a few stray molecules drifting invisibly through the glass, present in principle, but impossible to isolate by eye or by instrument. By the 30th generation, roughly the distance separating the Crusades from today, the glass looks completely clear. The ink hasn't vanished, not in any strict mathematical sense. It has simply been diluted so far past the threshold of detection that no test built to look for it will ever find it again. That is precisely what happened to the broader European ancestry carried by those 2 mixed ancestry soldiers in the Sidon pit. The Y chromosome alone survived that 30-generation dilution intact for the simple reason that it never agreed to mix in the first place, passing down whole and undiluted while the rest of the surrounding genome quietly dissolved into the water around it. Understanding why it faded, rather than persisting the way other historical migrations did, is really the scientific heart of this story, and it forces a comparison that most casual retellings of the Crusades skip entirely. Other massive movements of people across history left permanent, measurable genetic footprints exactly where you'd expect them to. The Mongol conquests under Genghis Khan, sweeping across Asia in the 13th century, left a Y chromosome lineage now carried by tens of millions of men across a huge swath of the continent. A genetic signature so widespread and so statistically overwhelming that it remains one of the most famous examples of a single lineage's reproductive success in the entire field of population genetics, the direct result of decades of sustained conquest, political dominance, and, by every historical account, a scale of reproductive access to conquered populations that has few parallels in recorded history. The Iberian colonization of the Americas after 1492 permanently reshaped the genetic ancestry of nearly every population from Mexico to Argentina, a demographic transformation still clearly visible in DNA 5 centuries later, driven by centuries of continuous immigration, permanent settlement, and colonial systems explicitly designed to entrench that new population as the ruling class for generation after generation. Both of those events shared something the Crusades never quite managed: enormous, sustained population movement, backed by permanent political control, lasting easily for centuries, and involving direct, repeated, often coercive reproductive dominance over conquered populations. The Crusades, by comparison, were smaller in scale, shorter in duration, and never came close to achieving lasting political control over the territories where the fighting happened. The Crusader states never achieved anything close to that scale or permanence. At their peak, the various Crusader kingdoms along the eastern Mediterranean coast held a modest, scattered European population, always a demographic minority surrounded by a much larger local majority, never achieving anything like political or numerical dominance over the region as a whole. And crucially, it didn't last. The Crusader states existed in fits and starts for less than 200 years before being systematically reconquered, culminating in the fall of Acre in 1291, which effectively ended organized Crusader presence in the Near East for good. 200 years is enough time for a mixed ancestry population to emerge visibly in a single mass grave. It is nowhere near enough time, especially for a small, politically fragile, ultimately defeated minority population, to permanently reshape the genetic makeup of an entire region once that population's descendants were reabsorbed generation after generation into the much larger surrounding majority. There is one genuine exception buried inside this story, and it's the detail that makes Layla's family legend so much more complicated than a simple yes or no. While the broad, genome-wide signal of Crusader ancestry faded to near invisibility in the general Lebanese population, Haber's team found that certain specific Y chromosome lineages of clear Western European origin have persisted at low but detectable frequencies in some segments of the modern Lebanese population, right up to today. The reason lies in the peculiar biology of the Y chromosome itself. Unlike the rest of the genome, which reshuffles and dilutes every single generation as two parents combine their DNA into something genuinely new, the Y chromosome passes from father to son almost entirely unchanged. Generation after generation, a single continuous thread rather than a blended mixture. Picture it as the difference between mixing two paint colors together and simply handing down a single unopened sealed envelope. Every other part of the genome behaves like paint. A European ancestor's contribution gets mixed in, then mixed again with the next generation's local partner. Then mixed again after that, diluting steadily toward invisibility the same way a single drop of dye eventually disappears into an entire swimming pool, one generation at a time, from 1/2 to 1/4 to 1/8 and onward, exactly the pattern Haber's team observed in the broader genome. But the Y chromosome isn't paint, it's the envelope, passed intact from father to son, opened by nobody, diluted by nothing, as long as an unbroken line of sons keeps existing to receive it. A European Crusader ancestor's overall genetic contribution to a descendant, 25 generations later, can fall below 1 part in a million and functionally vanish. That same ancestor's Y chromosome, carried down an unbroken male line, can still show up today, looking almost exactly as it did in the 13th century. A single envelope, still sealed, still legible, hiding inside a genome that otherwise looks almost entirely local. This pattern, a brief genetic flare that dies out within a few centuries, isn't unique to the Crusades either, which is part of why geneticists find the sight and results so compelling rather than merely curious. Similar transient pulses have turned up elsewhere in the genetic record. In Viking-era settlements in Greenland, where Norse ancestry briefly appeared in the local genetic record, and then vanished almost entirely once that colony collapsed and was abandoned, and in Roman Britain, where genetic signatures, pulled from across the breadth of the empire, flared during the centuries of occupation, and then faded again after the legions withdrew, and the province reverted to its earlier population patterns. Historians have long known these episodes happened. What the Sidon study offered that those other cases couldn't was precision. A tightly dated, individually sequenced snapshot of the pulse caught in the act, rather than a blurrier signal reconstructed from centuries of aftermath. The moment just before the glass of water cleared, rather than the clear glass alone. That single fact reframes everything Layla thought she understood about her own family story. A DNA test built around broad ancestry percentages, the kind most consumer testing companies advertise, was never going to detect a signal that faint. Genome-wide ancestry testing works by comparing large-scale patterns across the whole genome, and after 20 or 30 generations of intermarriage with the surrounding population, a single medieval European ancestor's overall genetic contribution to a modern descendant can realistically fall below 1 part in a million, mathematically present in the strictest technical sense, but functionally undetectable by any test built to measure broad ancestry percentages. If Layla's family legend has any genetic basis in reality at all, the only piece of it plausibly capable of surviving 8 centuries intact would be a Y chromosome lineage, passed exclusively down her family's paternal line, from father to son, a signal her own consumer DNA test was never designed to isolate in the first place, and one that, as a woman, she doesn't carry at all, a detail she only fully understood after reading Haber's study for herself, months after her own results had already left her disappointed and a little confused. It's worth being honest here about exactly how far the evidence can responsibly stretch, because a documentary that oversells this connection commits the same sin as the family legend it's investigating. The Sidon study documents genetic admixture and its subsequent dilution, specifically among the population of medieval and modern Lebanon. It does not and cannot prove that any single modern family's specific oral tradition traces back to one particular Crusader ancestor. Individual family legends of this kind, across Lebanon, Cyprus, and other former Crusader territories, vastly outnumber what any genetic study could plausibly confirm or deny case by case, and many almost certainly emerge later as a way of explaining an unusual name, a lighter complexion, or a family's historic alliance with European trading partners, rather than as literal, unbroken oral history stretching back to the 13th century. What the science can responsibly say is broader and, in its own way, more remarkable. The mechanism Layla's family described, European settlers intermarrying with local families during the Crusades, is not folklore. It happened, repeatedly, and it's written directly into ancient bone. Whether it happened specifically to her family is a much narrower question than the ancient DNA alone can answer. Which brings this investigation back, finally, to the assumption almost everyone starts with, and to the claim in the title of practically every viral post ever written about this topic, that the Crusades changed Europe's DNA forever. The actual scientific evidence points in essentially the opposite direction, on 2 separate levels at once. First, the best documented genetic legacy of the Crusades isn't found in Europe at all. It's found in the Near East, among the descendants of the people who stayed behind after the Crusader states collapsed. not among the population that sent the Crusaders out and received a comparatively small number of survivors back. Second, and more surprisingly, even that regional legacy, the one closest to the actual conflict, turned out to be temporary rather than permanent, diluted back toward invisibility within a relatively small number of generations, once the specific political and demographic conditions that produced it disappeared. If 200 years of religious war, mass migration, and documented intermarriage couldn't leave a lasting genetic mark on the region where all of it actually took place, the case for a comparable, lasting genetic transformation of Europe itself, a continent the Crusaders left from rather than settled in permanently, is considerably weaker than the popular version of this story assumes. None of that makes the Crusades genetically irrelevant, and it would be its own kind of oversimplification to end the story there. What the Sidon genomes actually proved, permanently and beyond dispute, is that history's neat categories, Crusader and local, European and Near Eastern, invader and defender, were never as clean in practice as they are on a map or in a textbook chapter. Real people, on both sides of one of history's most famous religious conflicts, fell in love, had children, and built mixed families in the middle of a war zone, generation after generation, for 200 years. That happened. It is not folklore and it is not myth. It simply didn't last long enough or involve enough people to leave the kind of permanent genetic signature that gets picked up by a 21st century DNA test, whether that test belongs to a curious hobbyist in Ohio or a woman on a porch in the Lebanese mountains, listening to her grandmother tell the same story one more time. Layla, for what it's worth, never did get a clean answer to her family's legend, and by the end of the investigation she said she'd made a kind of peace with that. The night probably existed, in some form, somewhere in the tangled, largely undocumented reality Haber's genomes hint at, but can't individually confirm. The odds, given what the study found in just 9 skeletons from a single mass grave, suggest that stories like hers were happening constantly, all along that coastline, for 200 years. Whether his blood specifically survived down to her, carried along some improbable, unbroken paternal thread for 800 years, or whether her family's story is a later invention grafted onto a real historical backdrop that countless other families in the region share, the science genuinely cannot say with certainty either way, and no test she could buy today was ever built to answer a question that specific. What it can say, with unusual confidence for a question this old, is that the story her grandmother told on that porch every summer was never really about one night, or one family, or one impossible romance. It was about something that happened to an entire region over and over for 200 years, until the war ended and the ordinary patient arithmetic of human populations quietly erased almost all the evidence, leaving behind only bones in a pit outside Sidon, a handful of stubborn Y chromosomes, still carrying their sealed, unread envelopes and family stories that may be the last fragile thing standing between what genuinely happened 8 centuries ago and what has since gradually and almost completely disappeared. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps a family story doesn't need a genome to confirm it in order to be worth telling. The legend Layla inherited wasn't really about a knight, or a surname, or a stretch of coastline visible from a porch. It was about belonging to something larger than a single lifetime, a thread connecting her across 8 centuries to a world that existed before anyone kept records, and to countless other families along that same coast quietly holding on to some version of the same story, told on some other porch, about some other knight who may or may not have existed either. That thread may be invisible to a DNA test. It may be nothing more than a story, repeated often enough to feel true. But stories, unlike Y chromosomes, don't dilute with time. They sharpen. Europe's DNA was never the one that changed forever. If anything survived at all, it survived here, on this coastline, in trace amounts, in silence, waiting 800 years for someone to finally go looking.